orderly and peaceful throughout. I now welcome Maritime Union of Australia, Australian Council of Trades Unions and the United Services Union to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and capacity in which you appear before the committee?
My name is Daniel Sherrill. I'm the Senior Policy Officer on Climate and Energy for the Australian Council of Trade Unions. Thanks.
Thank you.
And I'm Narelle Rich. I'm the Manager of Energy, Utilities, Private Sector and Airlines at the United Services Union.
Thank you. And Mr Newland?
Yes, coming in by telephone, Jamie Newland, Assistant National Secretary, Maritime Union of Australia.
Thank you. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Before I invite you to all make a brief opening statement and we proceed to discussions, would you please state if you're a current member or former member of a political party or a union or an investor in the renewable or nuclear industries, please?
Sure. So I'm not a member of any political party. I am a proud member of the Australian Services Union, and like many Australians, I assume my super fund is invested in the energy sector.
Yep, thank you.
I am a very proud member of the Australian Labor Party and a 33-year member of the United Services Union, a branch of the Australian Services Union nationally. And like Dan, I assume that my super fund has shares in some energy sources.
Thank you. Mr Newland?
Yes, member of the Maritime Union of Australia, member of the Australian Labor Party, and equally assume my superannuation fund.
Thank you. Thank you. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we head into questions, and we'll start with you, Mr Newland, while you're online there.
Well, thank you, Chair. Well, the Maritime Union of Australia represents roughly 13,000 workers in the shipping, offshore oil and gas, stevedoring, port services and commercial diving sectors. We are a division of the 120,000 member Construction, Forestry, Maritime Employees Union and an affiliate of the 20 million worker member International Transport Workers Federation. Basically, I think our submission really speaks for itself, but today we'd like to focus on three core issues: the transport and shipping of uranium and nuclear waste, the rights of First Nations and the storage of nuclear waste, and particularly the potential of offshore wind as a bulk source of electricity that is cheaper and quicker to develop than nuclear power. I might just leave it there, Chair.
That's okay. We've allowed it for others, so that's okay. Yeah. Mr Sherrill?
Thanks, Chair. Members of the committee, I know this hearing is standing between all of us and holiday break, so I'll get into it. An attempt to build nuclear generation in Australia would do significant harm to workers across the country. It would hit them in their hip pockets, in their job prospects, and in their safety at work. Nuclear power is one of the most expensive energy options available to Australia, period. Experts estimate it would cost between 2 and 6 times more than renewables like wind and solar, which are now by far the cheapest sources of new built electricity in the grid. That would jack up energy bills of working Australians by an average of $665 annually in the middle of a cost of living crisis. If instead the government were to underwrite the entire industry, as is sometimes being proposed, those costs would come through to workers in their tax bills. So either way, working people would be on the hook to pay for an expensive and, more importantly, unnecessary boondoggle. Contrast that with the $500 million the government just invested to retrofit social housing with solar panels, batteries, and electric appliances. Each of those houses is now projected to save $1,800 annually on their energy bills, while taking back control of their power production and storage right in their own homes. Though big promises have been made about job creation, the reality is that nuclear power is unlikely to ever create a single job in Australia. That for the simple fact that the economics simply don't stack up. Every single nuclear project that has commenced construction in a comparable economy over the past 20 years has been subject to massive cost blowouts and long delays. In the United Kingdom, for example, the proposed Hinkley Point C nuclear reactor has blown out from $18 billion to $93 billion Australian, with the startup date not projected to 2031, a full 15 years behind schedule. Meanwhile, the only small modular reactor project in the United States, Idaho's NuScale Power, was terminated completely due to exploding costs, with the project running almost 300% over budget, even with generous federal subsidies. And these are countries that have some history and expertise building nuclear power plants. Australia would be starting from absolute scratch. That explains why renewables saw 27 times the global investment flows of renewable last year. Particularly in Australia, nuclear has not and will likely never be able to attract the investment necessary to get off the ground, let alone grow to scale. So in the very unlikely scenario that a nuclear power industry did get up in Australia, it wouldn't come online until the 2040s at the absolute earliest, 2 decades too late for the workers and coal communities who need new opportunities now. And an emerging body of epidemiological research shows that even if they did finally arrive, those jobs would subject workers to significantly increased risk of cancer and circulatory disease. Final point, an attempt by the government to foist uncompetitive nuclear into the energy grid would draw effort and resources away from the transition to renewable energy, significantly slow down renewable investment by introducing high levels of investor uncertainty, hog grid and market space that cheaper renewables would be barred from contesting, and decrease the reliability and efficiency of modern grid operations with its inflexible demand-agnostic supply. In other words, nuclear would artificially delay the decarbonization of our economy by at least 2 decades. Workers simply cannot afford that delay. The climate crisis is impacting all workers in all sectors right now. Whether you're a nurse, you're a firefighter, extreme heat waves, storms, bushfires, and floods are making work more precarious, more grueling, and more dangerous. The health and safety of workers across this country depends on climate action. The nuclear fantasy would undermine that action, leaving working people at the mercy of rising temperatures. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Rich.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks to the committee for coming to hear us. I'm the Manager of Energy, Utilities, Private Sector and Airlines at the United Services Union, and we represent more than 30,000 members in New South Wales, primarily in local government, energy and utilities, but also in public and private sector clerical administrative jobs and airlines workers. We're a branch of the Australian Services Union, which has more than 130,000 members across Australia in those same industries and more. In every locality, village, town, and every small, medium and large metropolitan city across New South Wales and Australia, the United Services Union and other state branches of the Australian Services Union have members who maintain our roads and bridges. They collect our garbage, they ensure that we have safe, clean drinking water, they maintain our footy ovals and netball courts where our kids play weekend sport. They check out our books at the local library, they look after our children in council-operated childcare centres. Our members work in call centres. They do administrative work at your doctor's surgery, our accountants and lawyers' offices. They are our lawyers. They staff airports across New South Wales. But our members also work in the energy industry, from generation to retail. Our members work in local coal-fired power stations, which are being closed now. Our members need good, safe, well-paying jobs that they can get on merit. They need a just transition to these jobs with targeted training that builds on the transferable skills that they've got so that they can get these jobs of the future. But these coal-fired power stations are already closing and our members need the jobs now, not in 15, 20 or 30 years' time when we may see nuclear power stations come up out of the ground. Now. They need them now. They've got families to feed, to house, to clothe, to educate, and cars to fuel, and the list goes on. I believe you were in Muswellbrook recently, a regular country community. With people losing their jobs at power stations like Lake Liddell, it means that may mean that they have to move away from those towns that they've grown up in, that they've lived in and raised their families in. But when a worker loses a job in a rural community, it's not just one job. That worker generally has a partner who also works in the community, and they may have children, so it may mean that 2 or 3 children might have to leave a school. In one small school, the loss of 1 or 2 families with a couple of kids each could mean the loss of a teacher from that school and reductions in other areas in the town. Some years ago, during the threats of local government council amalgamations, the United Services Union commissioned research by the Emeritus Professor Brian Dollery from the University of New England. And that research showed us that it's actually 2.4 jobs that go from a rural and regional community when one job is lost. It's not just one job. So because this nuclear fantasy won't deliver one job in the next 20 years, you are denying our members 20 plus years of opportunities. Our members know a false promise when they see it.
Thank you, Ms Rich. And we'll start with you, Mr Chester.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Just to the ACTU, I note in your submission you refer to being a single representative voice for working people. And we heard in our inquiry in Latrobe Valley, Mark Richards from the MUA actually supports lifting the ban on nuclear and sees potential for jobs in Latrobe Valley for coal-fired power station workers. So do you acknowledge that at least some of the union movement have a level of support for considering nuclear, and it's not unanimous in terms of its opposition?
So the ACTU has had a policy opposing nuclear on economic, environmental, and safety grounds since 1981. It was ratified in our 1981 Congress policy, ratified by all affiliates. I believe the Mining and Energy Union in their submission to this inquiry were opposed to the idea, and that is for the simple fact that 90% of coal generation in this country will be retired by 2035. The earliest that nuclear could come online, and this is being very generous, is the early 2040s. So the timing simply doesn't match up to transfer those workers. And I think I'd add one more thing. On lifting the ban, first of all, the ACTU's position is absolutely not to lift the ban, because as I can discuss later, these jobs in nuclear power reactors are inherently dangerous. And I'm not talking about the risk of catastrophic meltdowns, which of course does exist, as we've seen with Fukushima not so long ago. I'm talking about long-term exposure to low doses of radiation, and there is an emerging body of epidemiological research that shows an established causal link between working at a nuclear power facility and increased risk of mesothelioma cancer. In residents surrounding that plant, the increased risk is also of thyroid cancer, and of circulatory disease, with the impacts felt most by children under 5. So for these reasons, we absolutely would not support lifting the ban, because these are not safe jobs. But again, even if we did lift the ban, that wouldn't change the fact that this industry simply cannot compete economically. And I think the final point I'll make is we're not really, the proposal on the table, as far as I understand it, is not merely lifting the ban. It is subsidizing this uneconomic industry to the tune of tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in taxpayer money, and that we are opposed to in the most strident terms possible.
So just to clarify, the evidence you gave then in relation to medical concerns, does that come from any medical training on your own behalf, or from research, looking at other reports, and you're quoting other reports, or do you have some background in medical areas?
Yeah, I am. So this comes from a 2024 academic meta-analysis in current environmental health reports, which is
professional opinion. It's
based on. This is one of the top academic public health journals in the world, and I'm happy to provide you with it off record. Yep.
Provide that later.
Yep.
That'd be great.
No
Thank you.
You also just said in your submission that it would take into the mid-2040s, which is not the evidence we've heard from other international experience in any case. Draw your attention to some evidence we received from US Professor Giacomo Bongiorno in relation to the total average cost of energy being reduced if nuclear was in the mix. And his argument was that you would reduce the need to overbuild renewables, in the sense that renewables obviously have an installed capacity, but they have an intermittency factor, so you would reduce the need to overbuild. Are you aware of his work, and do you have any thoughts on that the total average cost would be reduced by having some nuclear in the balanced mix?
So on the question of total average cost of a firmed renewables pathway versus a nuclear pathway, the CSIRO, this country's premier scientific expert body that has provided sage advice to government for decades, on which it has acted, has consistently established that the firm renewables path is the least expensive pathway to decarbonizing our grid, period. And that's not surprise, right? That echoes the plummeting costs of wind and solar around the world, which was one of the big stories in energy of the past decade. Just last week, the CSIRO established once again that large-scale reactors are about twice as expensive as wind and solar, small modular reactors 4 to 6 times as expensive, and there are a lot of experts that think that was too conservative because it's not taking into account first-of-a-kind premium in Australia, and it's not taking into account the fact that we haven't really seen cost declines and learning curves in the nuclear industry over the past decade. If anything, in many countries, it's getting more expensive because you have to add safety features to prevent the next Chernobyl. So the Australian Industry Group, a body that it's safe to say we don't always agree with, as the ACTU and forums like this, they've described that CSIRO analysis as scrupulously fair. Again, quote, scrupulously fair. So I think that when we're making decisions for Australia, we should rely on the body that is set up to provide expert energy advice on Australia, and that body has unequivocally said that this is far more expensive than the firmed renewable alternative. The last point I'd make here is that, again, we don't have to rely on a he said, she said story here. We can look to examples abroad where countries, comparable economies, are attempting to build these plants and seeing cost blowouts or delays that make snowy hydro 2.0 look relatively modest. And again, Australia would be starting from absolute scratch. Really the only country to deliver a nuclear power plant on time and on budget in the last 20 years have been China and the United Arab Emirates. And these are countries where you can pay workers peanuts, if you pay them at all. It's countries where you can bulldoze communities with impunity, where you can flout what little environmental regulation exists. So this is, I trust that for all the members of the committee, this is not the sort of country we would like to see Australia become. I think the last thing I'd say is, when you look at China, the Chinese invested 300 times more in renewables last year than they did in nuclear, 300 times more. So even if you're looking to that example, you can see where the wind is blowing. And yes, the pun's intended.
Thanks, Chair. And my final question, again, to Mr. Sherrill, just in relation to the impact of large-scale industrial renewables on regional communities, and I assume, and I shouldn't assume this, I assume you live in a metropolitan environment. Do you have any appreciation for the level of angst and concern right now in many regional communities in relation to the lack of respect shown to them for some of these renewable projects, and their view that they would like to see a smaller footprint for renewables as part of the balanced mix rather than a 100% renewable grid? Do you have any appreciation for the level of angst and frustration in regional communities right now?
Thanks for that question. I think I have appreciation for angst on both sides. There was polling released just last week by Demos AU that showed that there are only 38% of men and only 18% of Australian women who would be okay with a nuclear power plant being sited in their communities. So if we're talking about angst, that is a very clear indication of the public's opinion on, and frankly, level of comfort and safety with the nuclear power industry. But I think I'd also like, there's a premise embedded in this question that I'd like to contest, that we can have a system that's, you know, some nuclear, some renewables, and the former would back up the latter. And in fact, the opposite is true. These are mutually incompatible paths, and nuclear doesn't back up renewables, it undermines renewables, and that's for 3 reasons. First is if the government were to foist an uncompetitive energy source like nuclear onto the energy grid, that would undermine investor certainty, and investors like...
To the actual question in relation to the impact on regional communities and the concern about the size of the footprint. We haven't got a lot of time, so I'd prefer to talk about the actual question I asked.
Yeah, so again, I guess what I'd say to that is the level of concern from the polling data that I've seen is far greater for nuclear power reactors, and that's understandable given the health and safety risk to workers and residents that I just reviewed. And secondly, the proposition that you included in your question, which I wanted to address, that nuclear and renewables can coexist, is simply untrue. Nuclear undermines investor certainty for renewables. It, in many cases, would force rooftop solar off of the grid, and it would draw workforce and resources away from the frankly enormous progress we've made on nuclear, and pour them into an industry that will likely never be stood up because the economics cannot work.
Thank you, Mr. Chester. Mr. Burnell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for providing evidence. I I'll start by saying that I've been a proud member of the Maritime Union of Australia for 18 years, both as a member directly and as an associate member, and worked in the offshore gas and oil sector for 10 years. So I'll direct my questions to Mr. Newland, if that's okay. Jamie, if that's all right, if I can use it on a first-name basis, given we've been long-term friends, but I'm interested to get your understanding of the shipping requirements that will be needed for transportation of both uranium and enriched uranium and waste around this country, and what measures the MUA would be looking to have in place with Australian seafarers, etc.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Burnell, or Matt. Nice to talk to you. Look, I think from the outset, we don't want to be shipping nuclear waste or enriched uranium in Australia. Our submission is about the opposition to nuclear power and the nuclear industry. The submission speaks for itself. I'd like to sort of draw your attention to the transportation of nuclear waste and some of the problems we've seen, even from an Australian context, where we've had to ship spent nuclear waste from Lucas Heights to Port Kembla, and then shipped to France, reprocessed and returned to Australia. There is really no mechanism for checking the safety of these vessels, and one example that we've highlighted in our submission is the vessel BBC Austria, owned by a company called Breeze Schifffahrt, a company with a terrible safety record that has been detained in Australia and Spain, and was banned from carrying government cargoes in the United States for failing safety inspections. That vessel was required to carry spent nuclear fuel rods from Lucas Heights in and around Australian ports, and that's something that we don't want to see. And one of their other vessels, a BCC Shanghai, was chartered with bring reprocessed fuel waste from France to Australia, and again, that was a vessel that was banned from carrying United States cargo. So we would need really sufficient safety measures and standards in place. We have a very good regulator in Australia, although they could probably do with some more funding, given the amount of foreign vessels operating on the Australian coast that are often deficient and not paying the right wages. And similarly to an earlier contribution around the nuclear industry in China and UAE, some of these flag of convenience vessels have very poor labour conditions and wage rates, and it is what you would refer to as wage slaves or working slave labour. So we think there needs to be a lot more scrutiny on the transportation of nuclear material, and that's even before we get to the point of nuclear waste and how we transport that from any proposed nuclear reactor or nuclear power plant in Australia, and where that might be put.
So just going on from what you're talking about, those employment opportunities. So, and we keep hearing a lot of rhetoric around this is going to be a jobs bonanza for Australians across the country. So you're saying that under the current mechanisms in place with the Anstone facility and the export of waste offshore to come back recycled, I think that's what you were saying, that's currently not done by Australian seafarers, and I got the assumption that's unlikely to happen, to change.
That's correct. Foreign shipping and flags of convenience shipping is the main source of conveyance in Australia to export countries and importation, and it is incredibly unlikely that an Australian ship would carry any of that waste around Australia, diminishing any job opportunities. However, in saying that, there would be significant job opportunities in the maritime sector with offshore wind and renewables.
So on that front, so let's shift into the offshore wind proponent. So what does that look like for Australian seafarers and proponents of those construction projects in the way of jobs and ongoing employment?
Well, it'll be a massive boon for jobs in the regions in particular, and an economic boon, I think, for some of those regional areas, whether people live there or not, given the amount of approved offshore wind projects. And there's been reports delivered jointly through AREA, the Australian Resource Energy Employers Association, MILE, the Maritime Industry Australia Limited, and the three maritime unions around the need for increased training in the maritime space to be able to ensure Australians can have these good jobs in the renewable sector, in the maritime industry, and we think that'll be in the thousands, and good, high-paying, well-paid jobs.
And just my final question, Jamie, it goes to recent announcements by Peter Dutton, I think it was earlier this week, walking away from some offshore wind projects. Is there concern from your membership about those potential future jobs if the coalition are to continue to walk back from commitments in offshore wind generation?
Oh, absolutely. With the decline now we're seeing in the offshore oil and gas industry, just through natural attrition, we're having the decommissioning of offshore oil and gas assets now, and our members see there being a step program from decommissioning of offshore oil and gas assets into the renewable space, given you'll have very similar type vessels in that industry. So, yeah, our members see this as a growth opportunity and would be very disappointed if it was cancelled.
Thank you, Mr. Bennell.
Thanks, Jamie.
Mr. Kennedy.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Mr. Newland, just starting with you, I saw at your national conference there was a motion passed that said the National Conference of Members resolves that the union commits to banning the handling of waste, noting extreme health and safety risks, further commits to communicating with other transport unions on this issue. Given we've got waste from hospitals, universities, research labs, mining, defence, given we're embarking on AUKUS, which will produce nuclear waste, are you opposed to any of this waste also being transported?
Well, we have medical waste. I mean, this is a long-held discussion, and there's been debates in this country for a long time. Most of this and our opposition is that, you know, First Nations people and communities where nuclear waste is proposed to be sent have free, prior and informed consent before that goes on, and my union in particular has been involved in the discussions in South Australia. We've been involved in the protest in Muckaty in the Northern Territory over a couple of campaigns. And
But you admit we already have nuclear waste here.
Yes.
In
yes,
150 sites. Is that fair?
And that was my point. And a lot of it, yeah, is hospital grade, low level waste that sits in a lot of hospitals. We also know that the ANSTO facility at Lucas Heights has the capacity for the next 40 years to store the intermediate level waste that.
So are you against?
That site.
Could I just get you to answer the question directly? Are you against that waste ever being transported?
No, that low level waste is already transported.
How about enriched waste? How about enriched?
High level enriched waste? We disagree with.
How about enriched
and
waste from
position.
AUKUS? Are you against that ever being transported?
Well, AUKUS isn't here yet, so let's wait and see. Our view
That's policy, bipartisan policy. It's being rolled out. We're planning for it right now. The Albanese government's looking for a long-term waste facility. That's that's happening right now. Are you for or against that?
Well, our view is there needs to be prior informed consent before that that waste is sent anywhere in Australia.
So do I take from that you could be for it if there's consent? Is that what I take from that or not?
I'm saying that until there is informed prior consent,
then you could be.
We're not agreeing.
Okay.
We disagree with that concept.
Sorry, Mr.
If
Chair,
I
I've
could
got a
comment on
question
that
for you
briefly on the waste question. Could I comment on that
Well,
briefly?
could I ask you a specific question just because we're
Sure,
short
and
on
I'll add in the
time?
waste. Yeah.
I think you were referencing gen cost about the cost of nuclear, and I also believed you said something to the effect of nuclear does not complement renewables, but it undermines it. Might not have quoted you exactly, but that was the theme. Is that right?
That is right, yes.
So we had some, and we've tabled a report's been tabled to us from the US Department of Energy and their nuclear scientists, where they modelled the grid of California, and they looked at a solar and wind grid, and then they looked at a solar and wind grid, in their words, complemented by nuclear. In that solar and wind grid, they found the grid complemented, renewables complemented by nuclear. They found it was 37% cheaper. Strikes me California has a lot of sun. It's on the Pacific. It has a lot of wind. What do the scientists at the US Department of Energy not get that you get and we get? What's going on there? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. So I assume, Mr. Kennedy, you're referring to the DOE's Energy Liftoff report that they released last year. So I think this is really comparing apples and oranges to Australia for three reasons. The first, the U.S., again, already has an existing nuclear fleet, so it's not starting from scratch like Australia on cost, which is a huge deal when you're talking about first-of-a-kind premium. The second is that the report assumes that the new nuclear plants would be built simply as additional units to existing sites, which helps keep costs low, which again, Australia cannot do because we have no existing sites.
Just to challenge
And finally, it warns that delivering the first projects, I'm quoting, delivering the first projects reasonably on time and on budget will be essential. And the latest track record doesn't give us a lot of confidence on that, right? Like the last large-scale reactor to be built in the U.S. was the Vogtle plant in Georgia. It was 7 years late and $17 billion under
We're
budget.
talking about California. When you said they're building them on existing sites, California's only got one very small site.
Yeah, Diablo Canyon. Yeah, that's
correct.
what's being proposed.
Well, I don't think they're just proposing to build it on one single site in California.
The costs in that report assume that the large majority of new nuclear plants are being built as
But
additional
we're talking
units
about
to
the
existing
California.
sites.
Yes, that's the report for the entire tripling capacity by 2050. I think that's what you're referring to. My question,
For DOE
that report,
liftoff.
pardon?
For DOE liftoff?
Yes, it proposes
Yeah.
to triple nuclear capacity by 2050, and I think they
Yes.
talk about how to get to there. I'm talking about the specific California example, where you said, I believe you said nuclear does not complement renewables, it undermines it. How does the
Yes.
US Department of Energy get that it complements it and could bring 37? How do you reconcile
I'm not
those two
contesting.
statements?
I'm not contesting the expertise of the U.S. DOE. What I'm saying is the U.S. is in a deeply different situation to Australia because it has an existing nuclear fleet, and it's failed to
Can
deliver
we
the
just
first
please have some
projects on
respect
time.
from the people behind?
But
I'd also say-
does that take, it may not undermine renewables if it doesn't in California? Can you admit it may not undermine renewables in California?
No, and I think my point about it undermining renewables in Australia was actually quite different. So, 3 points, if I
But
may.
sorry, the question was, can you admit that it may not undermine? Or you think
No.
you think it undermines renewables in California? Is that your evidence?
I think it undermines renewables in Australia for three
I asked
reasons.
you about California, sir.
I don't know it. I'm
Well, then feel free
providing
to pass on the
evidence about
question.
Australia.
The question I'm asking you
Yeah.
is comparing to the US. So
And
if you can answer that question.
And the statement I made, because this is an Australian government hearing, is that it undermines Australian renewables for three reasons.
Sir, that wasn't
Undermines
my
investor
question. With
uncertainty.
respect, that wasn't my question.
Okay, fair enough.
So if you'd like to pass on the question, that's fair. But if you say I don't know, that's okay as well.
I think splitting that question into two, I can take it on notice the specific California example.
Okay.
The assumption that in that DOE report do not apply to Australia because the U.S. has an existing nuclear fleet.
Yeah.
I've read
If
that.
you could take it on notice, the California question, we'd love your answer. Sorry, is that the last question, Chair? Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. My question's to Ms Rich. The United Service Union represents power sector workers in places like Muswellbrook and Singleton and Cessnock and all through the Hunter and many other areas as well, where the nuclear reactor is slated to be. I note yourself, you are the manager covering the energy and utility sector. What are you hearing from your members and when it comes to nuclear, and what do your members, places like Muswellbrook, think that that's a good idea there or not?
So I think Dan earlier provided some statistics on the number of people in Australia who would be happy with a nuclear facility in their area. And I think I'd have to say that from the members that I've spoken to of ours, they kind of bear those statistics out. What members are telling me is that they just don't know enough about it. They're worried about the safety risks. They tell me that they're concerned about the health impacts. And again, I think there was some statistics spoken about earlier about the long risk of cancers, and many different types of cancers to people who are working in that industry, and not just those people, but their families who are in and around it in their towns. They're worried about water. With nuclear being such a thirsty industry and water supply being so uncertain, that's a real concern to them. And in the current cost of living crisis that we're experiencing, people are worried about how they're going to buy a loaf of bread now with such an expensive industry. What's that going to look like into the future? I guess that's just a few of the things that we're hearing from members.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And how do you think the prospective jobs differs from nuclear energy, a nuclear power station there, versus renewables in the area as well? Does it have a big impact, do you think?
Well, I don't think that our members, without certainly a great deal of training to make them ready for those jobs, some of the skills are transferable, but I don't think that they all are. And I think those people are really worried about how they get access to that with the such a big difference. They're, like I say, they've got some of the skills. Yes, some of them are transferable, but how are they going to get the skills? How do they train for them? And how long is it going to take before they can use them? But also, what are they going to do in the meantime?
Are you concerned about Liddell's already closed?
Yep.
Liddell Power Station's already closed. Araring is closing in 2 to 4 years. Just depends on what agreements come with state government there. Bayswater's closing by 2032 from AGL, and these are all being done from those private businesses that own those power stations. Are you concerned that there is a timing difference of when nuclear may come on versus when coal-fired power stations are slated to close in our area? Absolutely.
As I said in my opening statement, we don't have time to wait until a nuclear power station gets up out of the ground. That's going to be however many years down the track. We've got members who have got to feed families, clothe families, educate kids, do all of those things right now. This is going to take too long. It is going to be too expensive, and it is too dangerous.
Thank you very much. Ms Mascarenas.
Good morning. One of the witnesses was talking about the time delays associated with the build of nuclear power plants, and I think the time delay that was quoted was 15 years. And I just wanted to double check, was that maybe like 10 years of construction time plus 5 years of delay, or was that like a construction time period plus an additional 5 years?
My understanding of that 15-year figure is that it comes from CSIRO Gen Cost, and they're not building in significant delays, which is why several other researchers, namely Dr. Dylan McConnell, has said that actually it's likely to be much longer and be more expensive. But if we could comment on jobs more broadly for a moment. Again, we very much doubt that nuclear will ever create a single job in this country because it cannot attract investors, because it cannot compete economically. It's forecast to remain among the most expensive power sources in Australia for decades, and is currently, and for good reason, illegal federally and in many states and territories. And so when you ask Chair about the jobs and renewables, luckily we don't have to count on that mirage materializing in 2-3 decades. We've got jobs now in the renewable economy. So renewable generation is supplying at least 26,000 jobs in this country right now. And the renewable supply chain, so, critical minerals industry, for example, that's supplying about 13,000 direct jobs right now. The projects in the pipeline, just the projects in the pipeline, represent another 21,000 ongoing jobs. We've got 46 green hydrogen projects in the pipeline, and those are slated to create 24,000 direct jobs and 170,000 in construction. So these are huge industries. We've just put rocket fuel under them, thanks to the government's Future Made in Australia bill that was passed last week. So, we've seen analysis from Accenture that I'm happy to table if it's useful, saying that those industries, green hydrogen, critical minerals, renewable manufacturing, that were supported by Future Made in Australia, they could create 400,000 new jobs in this country by 2040, which is, in the most generous analysis, the year in which nuclear would be taking its first baby steps. So again, we don't have to rely on it. It's unnecessary for jobs, and it's unnecessary for energy. We've got cheaper, quicker options that are far better for the climate.
I have an additional question which relates to safety incidences associated with nuclear power plants, but from the perspective of the construction phase. And so over the life of a project, so construction but also operation, there'll be safety incidents. One of the things that we haven't necessarily seen statistics on is safety incidences during construction. And this was a question that I asked for some people that were working on nuclear projects in the UAE. Has the union movement done analysis on safety data from lost time injuries, etc., for new nuclear plants that are being built?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think we haven't conducted an analysis, partially because it is, you would be surprised to know that the data out of the UAE on worker health and safety is obscure and often inaccessible. So what we have focused on in terms of health risks is, once it's built, as I've mentioned, the long-term cancer and circulatory risks from low doses of radiation, again, within regulatory limits, and they are still causing significant causal increases in mesothelioma cancer in workers at those plants. And this is from a study that looked at 175 nuclear power plants around the world, sample size of about 500,000 workers. And this is a study published this year. So I'm sure I'm happy to look into that, the injuries and workplace hazards in the construction phase of nuclear. But even after the construction phase, those safety risks don't go away. They're actually, we are finding out, inherent in the industry because those workers are exposed to low doses of radiation every day they go to work.
So one of the inquiries I've been working on has been on financial abuse and about products being designed with safety by design. Do you think that this can be done in the nuclear power industry in Australia?
Sorry, you said safety by design?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so look, when we talk about safety of a nuclear power plant, you can't really mitigate around that risk of low-dose radiation exposure that I'm aware of, given that it's inherent in the industry. And in fact, those risks for increased cancer, thyroid cancer in particular, in that study were actually higher for residents surrounding that plant because workers at the plant do have in place certain safety measures. But I think we again have to look at the risk of, the other risk that's sort of the elephant in the room here, which is of catastrophic meltdown, which we saw with Fukushima in Japan. It is fair to say that this is a low risk, and that there does exist, since the days of Chernobyl, let's say, anti-seismic technology that you can put in nuclear power plants that mitigates the risk. But again, that technology is really expensive. So either you're exposing communities to a small but very real risk of catastrophic meltdown, or you're adding enormous cost to these plants that leads to even further cost blowouts. It's very difficult to get out of that bind.
Thank you, Ms. Mascarenhas. Unfortunately, we've run out of time today. If you have been asked to provide any additional information, including questions on notice, please forward it to the Secretary